Welcome back to campaign diary number 2, and a lot happened. We finally follow up on some information that Astrid got. Astrid's connection to the Fae Jess, who's from the Winter Court, just so happens to leave her a envelope on her car. That good handwritten, fancy stained envelope, very old-fashioned. And in it is a letter, not really so much detailing information that Jess found, so much as it is an address for Astrid to go and meet them at. So jump to Astrid in her car, Uber driver punches in the address, finds it no problem. Turns out it's a woods just outside of town, and Jess is nowhere to be seen. And so Jess is pulling along, driving slowly by the woods, when she gets a little tap on the window, and it's Jess. Very old school Batman style appearance. Here we actually get to see Jess for the first time. Jess is more fashionably and functionably dressed. I believe we agreed on some type of silver white hair, a pea coat, very proper. But when you focus on, there's something alien about her features. But I'm sure we'll go ahead and dig into more about what she looks later, but for now we had some brief introductions, and Jess and Astrid traveling down this old path into some woods. Things start to get real weird because we see that time changes walking down this path. Though it's light outside in the human world, as they walk down the lane, things begin to get darker and more spooky. Eventually, the two come across a cabin in the woods with a fence around it made of bone. We see Jess use some type of password to make a door appear out of the cabin walls, and they enter. Inside is a dimly lit cabin interior with a kitchen where they find an old woman cooking over the stove. We get an interesting depiction as we see this old woman reach for things on shelves far away as her arms elongate to strange sizes of 4, 5, 6 feet long. She retrieves an item and pulls it back to her. Jess asks the old woman some questions pertaining to the Winter Court and offers up the floor for Astrid. Here, Astrid talks about the writers, tries to figure out who or what they are and how they function. Astrid also brings up the feather, which happens to give the old woman a bit of pause. Eventually, the old woman dismisses everything and they turn to leave. Not before they pay a price. We see Jess retrieve a bag from the inside of her pea coat, which seems to carry impossible size of things, and we see a bag given to the woman containing a white powdery substance, which she then exclaims to be children, and puts it into her cooking project and sits down to eat. If you haven't figured it out yet, this is my interpretation of what Baba Yaga looks like. Anyway, we see these two slink off and leave the house and have a heartfelt one-on-one in the woods. Clearly, Astrid's freaked out about giving powdered children to some ancient old woman who happens to be Baba Yaga. So, we instead have Astrid and Jess in the woods have a heartfelt moment where they discuss any questions they might have between the two. This is important, namely because we are still trying to establish the relationship between the pararomantic and her guide. So Jess decides to give Astrid a pea blossom. For those who don't know, pea blossoms are kind of that flower equivalent of, thanks for hanging out, I had a good time, here's this flower. As it turns out, my players are much smarter than I, and I didn't know it at the time, but it worked out great, and I knew it the whole time. Eventually, we see Astrid get back in the car, questions answered, feeling a little bit more fulfilled about her relationship with her guide, where they exchange a few words about getting to meet one another. They talk about any experiences or thoughts. We have Astrid discuss any types of thoughts or feelings she might have about her first foray into the Fae, and we're on our way. So here's where we jump back to the rest of the group. What are they up to? It turns out that Valerie has taken this information and decided it's a good idea to get everybody rounded up and go check out the woods for themselves. Now here's the interesting part. There's only one car between the group, and it's the Uber driver who just happens to be outside of town. So, how do you get a car? Well, it turns out Val Raven's got a disguise for everything and just so happens to have a shirt for a hotel valet service, picks up a car no problem, and they're on the way. So these are two great time gaps, and I wanted to make this story more interesting and also didn't want to have to fill time, so I decided that by the time Astrid gets out of the woods, perhaps time's a little bit warped and she just so happens to kill those 2 hours on her end, to where she needs to meet up with the rest of the group at the woods where the hunter was originally killed. And this is where the fun begins. I personally didn't plan for the group to go back to the woods. Most of my setting was set for some other direction, but alas, here we go. It all worked out. The group decides to try to locate where this bird is. There must be something important about the bird, and they need to follow up on it. We see Thomas use his powers again to kind of hone in and concentrate on this creature and find that it's still within the woods. We also have Valraven use his powers to try to figure out where the riders are at the time. Turns out they're both in the woods. So we have Omina use her animal senses to kind of help move things along in the woods. We have our supernatural skills helping us find the path as well, until eventually we come across a tiny little bird in a half-circle bowl in the ground filled with ash. Just to give you an idea, it's some type of phoenix-like creature that is trying to grow back from the ashes, and they've just happened to stumble upon where it died and is slowly reconstituting itself. But Joel, you may ask, is this the interesting part? No. Turns out the rider is also there, not but 50 feet away. Luckily, Omina's animal perception skills happens to see that there is a rider out in the distance looking through the woods for something. So, Valraven decides to sneak up and scoop up the little bird into his arm and make their way out of the woods. This is where we get that movie picturesque scene where Valraven creeps up to pick up the bird, steps on a twig, and it snaps and rings throughout the woods. The rider turns his attention to the sound and charges. Here I have everybody make act under pressure rolls, and we have 1 success, 2 partial successes, and 1 flat out failure, which, to my surprise, the consequence says all hell breaks loose. Thomas, with a great success, uses his tiny wiry frame to navigate in between the trees and start to bolt for the entrance of the woods. Valraven, with a partial success, finds that he'll have to take a longer path to get around because carrying a baby bird does not make you as agile as everyone else. So Omina has a partial success, which means I need to come out with some type of cost to pay. Astrid completely fails. So this is that situation of someone pulls you along in a direction, you turn and clock yourself into a tree branch. This is where we see Astrid lean up from the ground in a dizzied state, and she sees that 5 very large white direwolves are stalking somewhere. Players have all made their move, consequences have been had, and thus the rider closes. As things are still early on in the story, I didn't exactly want to have harsh penalties for everything that's happening, but still wanted to make it interesting. We see Thomas finally makes his way to the edge of the woods and finds that there are red and blue flashing lights and a white spotlight looking around the woods. This is where I incorporate introducing Officer Grady into the story, where he makes things more complicated for the player characters, but ultimately not a big portion of the story yet. Turns out Officer Grady wanted to go back and check on the woods and finds that there's 2 cars parked outside. It's kind of weird, so he pulls up, runs the plates, starts figuring out what's going on, and here's a twig snap in the woods to where he starts to go investigate. Valraven finally makes it the longer path around some obstacle in the woods and meets up with Thomas. By the time Astrid and Omina are back up on their feet and have moved, the rider has already closed but has been blocked off by a fallen log. A couple more act under pressure rolls and we find that Omina and Astrid take off in a completely different direction, away from the wolves, away from the riders, and also away from the police. We see Thomas, now that he's made his way to the edge of the woods, begin to creep back in away from the police lights and try to hide somewhere, and steps on a twig and snaps, thus connecting our 2 perspectives of both the police officer and Thomas. We then see the police officer's light snap onto Thomas, he retrieves his weapon, points it at him, and asks him what he's doing there. We then see Valraven, arms filled with a tiny mythical bird, collide right into the back of Thomas. This is a great opportunity because now it puts the 2 groups of people separated from one another, and now they have to team up together to try to get out of both of their difficult situations. Thomas and Valraven come up with the idea that they are in fact LARPers in the woods trying to secure some type of arena or area in which to have their next encounter in. The police officer, not quite sure what LARPing is in this day and age, decides to bring them up to the car and run their IDs. Back to Astrid and Omina, we see that they are running for their lives. They decide to turn, dive into a hollowed out tree, and hide as they wait for the rider to pass by. The rider does eventually pass by, and they hold their breath for what seems like a minute or 5 minutes. Suddenly, a muscle bound arm reaches into the tree trunk and retrieves them. As they gather themselves off the ground, they look up to find 4 people who are naked and 1 very large wolf. Turns out these wolves are also some type of shapeshifter. Astrid and Omina scramble up, trying to figure out what they should do with themselves, and are questioned by the wolves. As it turns out, not only did the wolves scare away the rider as they outnumbered them, they also don't appear to be threatened by Astrid and Omina. It's at this point that I'd like to mention, based on Astrid's investigation, she didn't share any of her information from the Baba Yaga discussion. Omina has no idea who these wolves are, who their allegiance are. The two try to make a persuade someone roll, and it doesn't really go too well, but I'm not going to make them pay a huge consequence. The group of direwolves rough them up a little bit. Astrid forgets her bat inside the tree, and Omina loses her treasured Waffle House shirt. We see Astrid and Omina stumble their way back towards their cars and also fall into the light of the police. This is where we see Valraven and Thomas are having their IDs run. Of course, Valraven has a million fake IDs and gives them the one with the most nerd cred. As the officer is interrogating these two, we see the group of the other two take the step out of the woods, and the officer just sighs. I thought it best to play the officer off as some old man who maybe doesn't understand what kids are into nowadays, maybe expects phones and computer games and has no idea what LARPing is. It was a fun interaction. This is when the officer questions Astrid and Omina what they were up to. This is where we get to dive into a little bit of the backstory between Omina and Astrid, and we see that Omina zips up her sweater, now missing her shirt, and sheepishly mentions that they were looking for something. The officer raises an eyebrow, as he's not quite sure what activities they were doing, but decides to brush it off for the better. This is where we bring up the troubled romantic history of both Astrid and Omina. As the pair are romantic, there's always a heart that gets broken. As it turns out, it just so happens to be Omina in this case. IDs are run, stories are set straight. The police officer sets them off with a warning because he's not quite sure what LARPing is. After the police officer takes off, the group has a moment to themselves. Thomas and Valraven decide to head back to Valraven's place. Astrid and Omina decide to go to the local Walmart and maybe find some type of bird seed and bedding. They're not quite what to do with this bird. Everyone goes their separate ways, but we do have a fun little RP encounter. Omina's a little bit rambunctious, and they wanted to make sure that Omina and the bird are not in the same car, so Omina rides with Astrid back to Valraven's place. This is where we make a connection between Omina's senses of the wolves, which was something that reminded her of dogs, but also reminded her of the Winter Court. So, when Omina gets scent of the pea blossom, she immediately thinks wolves, even though it's really just the scent of the Winter Court. Omina, who wants to get rid of this scent, rolls down the window, hastily grabs the pea blossom and chucks it out the woods. This is where me as the keeper realizes that a player just threw out a magical object that I gave to a player. We're going to file that in my notes under bullshit. The two have a heart-to-heart discussion about their past, where things are now, and possible futures between Astrid and Jess. Eventually, the entire group meets back up at Valraven's. During this time, Valraven was taking care of the bird. Thomas goes to drop off the car, and Valraven falls asleep holding the bird. He's woken up as Astrid and Omina come through the front door, and the bird has lost a lot of the ash, but gained a lot of mass. As it turns out, they decide that this bird is some type of phoenix and is perhaps slowly reconstituting itself. Now that it's lost its home of ash, it'll take much longer for it to regrow. Personally, I'm not sure what to do. I broke the first rule, which is don't give your players some type of creature to take care of. We start to wrap up the story, and I leave the group with a closing scene. We see that same black rider continue to ride into the night as he enters another woods, goes up to a tree, and knocks on it. Here, we see him speak Russian, and we enter with English subtitles, where he asks if someone's home. The tree opens up to reveal some type of troll giant creature. The knight reports to the creature that he was so close to retrieving the bird, but was delayed by the wolves. The creature inside the tree mentions that he'll take care of the wolves. The creature then closes the door, the rider walks out, and we see the sun slowly start to peek above the horizon. And we see as this black rider changes from black metal armor into a white flowing gown, some type of chainmail. We also see as his horse changes from black to white. The rider is now a woman with long white flowing hair, and instead of a longsword has a falchion. Hopefully this gives the players more questions, things to investigate into, and maybe a little sense of danger. Thanks for hanging out and listening to this one. This is a little bit shorter of a diary as there's a little bit more tension and more of an action sequence, even though the session itself was a little bit longer. Things are starting to fall into groove as far as the game is concerned. I think for the most part, I'm going to ignore any type of roles or situations that we find ourselves in unless they're particularly useful. I'll probably be interjecting a little bit of game notes of things I decided on the fly, as well as changing any game mechanics that I think made the session work out just a little bit better. I'm thinking that possibly in the future we might go to broadcasting the episodes on Twitch. I'm not terribly sure yet. All I know is that my players seem to be enjoying the game, and that's good feedback for me. Make sure to keep an eye out on any social media, and I'll probably update there as to whether or not we're going to be broadcasting these episodes. As always, thanks for listening or watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.